I'm Crystal Parikh. I'm the director of the Asian Pacific American Institute at New York University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight. First, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the APA Institute at NYU is located on the unceded land of the Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. We would also like to recognize that New York City is currently home to approximately 100,000 people who identify as Indigenous, including many peoples from the Pacific. And if you're unsure about whose land you are on, we encourage you to find out. We at the Institute affirm our commitment to working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, and today we are offering a few ways to support Native and Indigenous communities. And this semester we are highlighting the Maui Cultural Center of Lahaina, Indigenous Peoples Day NYC, and the Palestinian American Medical Association. Links to support their work can be accessed via the QR code on the slide. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsor, NYU Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality, for co-sponsoring the event tonight. And I'm especially grateful to the staff at the APA Institute for their efforts for tonight's event and for all the programming that we do. Tonight's event is part of our year-long programming initiative titled Learning as We Go, in which we ask what it means to learn and teach as and about Asian Pacific Americans. Attacks on critical race theory, diversity, inclusion, and equity efforts, and academic freedom pose difficult challenges for teachers and students across the country at the current moment. And yet we recognize that education takes many forms and avenues well beyond academic institutions and classrooms, and this has been especially true in struggles for racial justice. This year we pay careful attention to the pedagogies and knowledge that our communities have cultivated and share with one another and to others across the nation and the globe. And with a body of work that examines and imagines the lives of colonized peoples, immigrant laborers, LGBTQ communities, and colonized peoples in new and exciting ways, we've been especially delighted to host Isabel Sandoval as our artist in residence for the 2023-2024 academic year. US-based Philippine-born Isabel Sandoval has emerged as, in the words of the Criterion Collection, one of the most exciting and multi-talented filmmakers on the indie scene with a bold approach to cinematic style. And meanwhile, the Museum of Modern Art has recognized her as a, quote, rarity among the young generation of Filipino filmmakers, end quote. She's directed 3 feature films. Her debut, Señorita, premiered at Locarno. Her critically acclaimed 3rd feature, Lingua Franca, premiered in Venice and was nominated for an Independent Spirit Award. She starred in the César Award-winning short film, Maria Schneider, 1983, directed by Elizabeth Subrin. She is also directed for television, including the acclaimed limited series Under the Banner of Heaven, starring Andrew Garfield and Samuel Worthington, and The Summer I Turned Pretty. Sandoval is developing her 4th feature, Tropical Gothic, which won a development prize at the 2021 Berlinale. And in 2022, she was invited to join the prestigious Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences, having, again in their words, demonstrated exceptional accomplishments in the field of theatrical motion pictures. And she is, of course, the 2023-24 Artist in Residence at the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU. And this is actually her final event. It seems like it's coming to a close too soon, but it's part of her residency. So her talk tonight, in her own words, is her final public program. And we'll be beginning with Isabel's lecture, followed by questions from the audience, which will be taken on note cards that the staff will be collecting in the aisles. And we'll close with the reception. We're going to first begin by playing a clip from a filmmaker that had a great influence on Isabel before we invite her to the stage.
Leslie Chung was definitely in my dreams that night and for many nights after that. I wanted to start this evening, of course, by thanking everyone for coming. You came. It means a lot, so thank you for joining me this evening. I have friends, dear friends here as well, collaborators. And I wanted to start this evening, my final event for NYU APA by acknowledging an inspiration, Wong Kar-wai. But I also wanted to take a moment to celebrate and honor the memory of another inspiration, a trans advocate, activist, and author Cecilia Gentili, who passed sadly and unexpectedly today. We will miss you, Cecilia, and we hope that you rest in power. Speaking of inspiration, I owe who I am as an artist, as a filmmaker, especially one who is self-taught. I did not go to film school and do not have a conventional background or education in film, to the artists and auteurs whose work have had a major impact on me, especially, and I would consider this the formative years of my cinephilia, like high school and college, growing up in Cebu, Philippines. And it's funny because, at that time, aging myself, this is like the late 90s, early 2000s. We don't have streaming, we don't have an easy and convenient access to the works of world cinema. But there was a phenomenon that made that access very much possible. That is piracy. Piracy. And there was even like another format at that time was a video CD. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with that. And that was how I came across the works of Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Kurosawa, Bergman, Almodovar, and of course Wong Kar-wai. And I realized that if I played a scene from In the Mood for Love, that would have been way too predictable. Because they talk about it nonstop. But this scene really stayed with me and stuck with me for years and years. And in a way, it feels like I've come full circle in that I'm about to shoot a new film. It hasn't been mentioned by Crystal earlier, but in less than 2 months, I'm going to be shooting a new film in the Philippines, and one scene is directly inspired by the scene from Days of Being Wild. But I mentioned that I feel like I've come full circle in that when I was first starting out as a filmmaker, and especially while making my first 2 features, I think there was a strong impetus or drive to really prove myself a genuine, a legitimate filmmaker, that people should pay attention to by making an homage, direct nods and references to the masters and auteurs to prove that I'm somehow literate, in the medium, in the language of cinema. But since that time, since I first started, I've gone on a journey. I've been on a trajectory of discovering who I am, really evolving, transforming, realizing my place in relation to others, my place in the world, and how incredible and remarkable it is that I've somehow come to the same place of appreciating and being inspired by a scene like this. But this time, the impetus is not simply mimicry or homage, but a kind of alchemy. An alchemy between the visual and thematic inspiration of, say, Wong Kar-wai, but also my own experiences. Finally, knowing who I am as a person, as an artist, and making that come to the fore in my work. And
with Wong Kar-wai, for instance, I've been very much influenced by Days of Being Wild, In the Mood for Love in 2046, the other filmmakers that have really made a strong impact on me were Chantal Akerman, especially Jean Dillman, and Who's From Home. And then I also had an Ingmar Bergman face, Persona, of course. And I think when I was discovering those works and those filmmakers, I was trying to figure out, what about them and what about those works really drew me to them. Like what about this scene, I think captures and encapsulates my passion and my love for cinema. It's, I think, to experience and to feel that emotion. That is the reason that we come to the movies for. And I think the scene is to be seen, to see and to be seen, to desire and to be desired. And in my own case, in my own experience as an only child who was raised by a single parent, I was raised by my mother, I learned to be independent and also stubborn and very headstrong and self-reliant early on. And so in my mind, I remember at a very young age, after having seen mainstream Filipino films for sure, which is my first encounter with cinema. Really, I would find myself coming up with this, inventing these fictional characters in my mind and coming up with a story visually. I don't necessarily come up with ideas or stories like words on a page, but they would come to me in pictures, not just pictures, but moving pictures that I would edit mentally. So I feel like I started out really as an editor, stringing together scenes to form a narrative, to form an arc for a certain character. And inevitably, as someone who comes up with these fictional characters, I would end up projecting myself. And it's a process that both conscious and subconscious. But one pattern that I would notice is that the characters, the protagonists that I would come up with are individuals. They might be, they tend to be outsiders. They occupy the margins, who have secrets, and who find themselves navigating and traversing two different realms and two different worlds. And in that sense, they are different and they are aware that they are different. I was very much, cognizant of that from a young age, going to school. I went to a Filipino Chinese Catholic school, and everyone, were, have parents who are married, but not everyone were attracted because it was, an all-boys school, and I found myself at a very young age, appreciating the beauty of other boys. And but one thing I can say for myself at that young age was that I didn't really, or at least privately and internally, I never castigated, or beat myself up for being different. I feel like, having been, an only child, I actually quite relished and enjoyed having that status. Being different meant being unique, being singular. And freed me, I think, from the pressure of being just like everyone else, which I imagine has to be, quite boring, at the end of the day. And, with that, awareness and that epiphany, I kind of retreated into this inner world where I was creating these fantasy and fictional characters. And that became the predominant theme of what is now like 3 features and 1 short film that I've done. Señorita, my very first feature, is about a trans sex worker who finds herself becoming a double agent after she moves from the city to the province to start a new life and realizes that her former VIP client as an escort in Manila is a close associate of the corrupt town mayor who is running for re-election in the local town that she's in. And I made that a few years after moving here to the US, but I went back home to Cebu to make that film, and I actually started developing the script for Señorita even before I realized that I was transgender. And it was in the process of making that movie that I came to that realization, by inhabiting this invented character and playing that character in front of the camera and somehow arriving at a truth about myself in the process. And with Señorita and the follow-up film after that, Apparition, one of the things that I told myself was, 1, I want to really, pay an homage to like Wong Kar-wai, the directors that influenced me. And so I remember telling the scorer for Señorita, I want the musical score for this to sound exactly like In the Mood for Love. But change a few notes, so it's not like a total. And also to subvert that genre or the kind of film that it would typically be branded or identified as, and at that time it would be Art House Philippine Cinema, since it was a Filipino film that we were submitting to international film festivals. And when you have Filipino films that have queer characters, especially gay and trans characters, are almost always the object of derision or ridicule. They are kind of one-dimensional, stereotypical characters, and so I wanted to make a film that was grittier, that was maybe a little more morally complex and layered. And it was when I watched Clute and Jane Fonda's towering performance in it, Clute by Alan Pakula, that gave me the idea for Señorita. And so I wanted to make a queer Filipino film that was different from what they were making at that time. And to my surprise, my pleasant surprise, it was programmed by Locarno, the film festival in Switzerland, which is actually renowned for programming, experimental, genuinely daring, formal works, and a lot of the filmmakers that play at Locarno end up graduating to the likes of Venice and Cannes. And the reception of Señorita, it was nominated for Best Picture by a leading critics group in the Philippines, emboldened me to jump right into my second feature, which is called Apparition. And apparition is the polar and I think spiritual opposite of senorita in that it's about nuns. And it's set in the early 70s during a tumultuous time in the Philippines martial law. And it's about cloistered Catholic nuns who find themselves under siege amidst the growing political unrest in the country. And I think the rule or the convention that I wanted to deviate from and subvert with apparition was the talky and screechy and melodramatic Filipino film. And one thing that I'm still really proud of about the film is that there's a 10-minute sequence of a couple of scenes where there's no dialogue. I mean, it is set in a monastery, but those scenes are some of the most emotionally intense and harrowing scenes in the film. And, up to that point, how I identified myself and distinguished myself as a filmmaker was really to juxtapose, in juxtaposition to what others were doing, and to ask myself, what am I doing that's different, or unique, or that's inimitable in some way, or that others have not attempted or tried. And after Apparition came out, that was when I decided to lay low and pursue my gender transition. And it's remarkable, and this is a realization that I've come to, certainly not at a time, but with a distance of a few years, and after I made lingua franca, that being finally comfortable in my own skin as a person, and embracing who I am as a person, brought forth a certain confidence and self-possession and recognition of who I'm becoming as a filmmaker. And I think it was at that point, it was at that transitional point, both as a person, as an artist, that I can confidently say that I'm not just blindly mimicking or copying certain flourishes in the works of the filmmakers that really moved me and inspired me, but I'm starting to pull something from deep within and from deep inside and combine that with the works and the filmmakers that have inspired me to come up with an aesthetic and a sensibility and a language that somehow, is starting to look and sound and feel like my own. And I wanted to show you this clip from my latest feature, Lingua Franca, to demonstrate that concept that I was talking about. So that is the opening scene from Lingua Franca. But I also want to acknowledge, because we have here with us tonight the cinematographer of Lingua Franca, Isaac Banks. Hi, Isaac. I thank him for these gorgeous videos. So that montage of essentially, scenes of Americana, those are shots taken in Brighton Beach and Coney Island in Brooklyn, are direct references to News from Home by Chantal Ackerman. But what's funny is that I didn't realize that until I was in post and I was cutting it and started showing my work to friends. And it just goes to show that the art that has really left an indelible impression on us kind of work their way into our DNA as artists. And so at the opportune or the right moment, they just sneak their way out of our subconscious into our consciousness and sort of influence what feels right for us as artists in our own work. But I think this reference becomes, in the process of mine, is I'm juxtaposing these indubitably American scenes and imagery with a voice of a different tongue, a Filipino language. And it's not even Tagalog, it's Cebuano, which is my native language. Starting from inspiration by Chantal Ackerman and setting it in a milieu or an environment that's typically James Gray-esque. I was able to impose in the very opening frames of my film that this might be a story set in America, that you are viewing it from a different vantage point, a different eye, and from a different consciousness. And I think that is how my sensibility has evolved up to that point, in that, as an artist, my approach to character is that they are very much a product of the environment that they're in, whether they're, born there or find themselves moving or migrating there. And in fact, my identity also truly emerged in stark relief after plucking myself out of my home country and transplanting myself here in the US, where we are, as minorities, labeled or referred to as the other. And I also realized that in dignifying a collective that is a minority, the irony and the paradox of accomplishing that, not by characterizing the collective as a whole, but by honing in on and focusing on an individual, an individual life, an individual experience, and expressing that life and that experience in all its detail, its idiosyncrasies and nuances. Not making any statement, any grandiose statement that one experience, encompasses or represents that totality of the experience of that collective, but showing that this one life, how no matter how seemingly invisible or voiceless it is, counts. For those who haven't seen Lingua Franca, it's about a Filipina trans woman who works as a caregiver to an elderly Russian woman in Brighton Beach and becomes romantically involved with her slaughterhouse worker grandson, without that adult grandson, without that man knowing that she might be trans. And when I was making the film, I asked myself again with how do I subvert or deviate from certain norms and conventions when it comes to the kind of film that Lingua Franca would purportedly be in. It's a different kind of, it's I think 3 or 4 different kinds of films. It's a New York film. And when we think of a New York film, we think of Spike Lee. It was a very, very distinct look, especially with Do the Right Thing, for instance. We think of, besides James Gray, we think of the Safdie brothers. And I was thinking, maybe James Gray has set a few of his films in Brighton Beach, like Two Lovers, Little Odessa. But how do I capture the experience of characters in that milieu, in that neighborhood, which is a distinct personality all its own. When I was making Lingua Franca, I was living in Crown Heights at that time. And it's really just Brighton Beach is like a 35-minute express ride from Crown Heights all the way down, but you feel like you're being whisked off to and transported to a totally different world. Feels like being stuck in time in like the 50s and 60s. And the different neighborhoods in Brooklyn or Queens, the outer boroughs of New York City really feel that, and that not necessarily like the period film sets, but that they have their distinct vibe and color and personality. And I think in terms of personality, Brighton Beach felt more like me. And so I made a New York film that was a lot quieter than you'd expect it to be, where the emphasis is not on the noise or the dialogue, but in the silences and the pauses and the gaps between communication. And I was also grappling with the trans film, and many trans films at that time were made by filmmakers who were not trans, and there tended to be a fixation and obsession with the transition process. And when I was making Lingua Franca, I was done with that part of my life, and I wanted to really show someone, I wanted to show a life as they're going about their day-to-day rituals. That there might be forces, external and broader, socio-political forces that are adversarial and hostile towards this person, but who, say, in the privacy and perhaps the smallness of their life, manage to find a sliver of hope, of companionship, of tenderness, and love. And realizing that, even though they might be struggling to get legal status and a green card, that they can be horny. Sure. And that is, what I was thinking while I was doing the sensual scenes in Lingua Franca, how exploring and expressing and conveying desire, within that character, how that could be such a defiant and strong expression and assertion of agency, because the mere fact they're able to be actively wanting something and desiring something expresses agency and dignity as well, in that despite the forces that may conspire to oppress you, or say put you in your place, or what they think is your place, that you're able to come back with something that they can never take away from you, or colonize, or govern. Something that is completely within your domain as a person. And that is, your inner life, your inner emotional and spiritual life. And I think that was my big realization while making Lingua Franca, and it also, I think, is a transition point to where I am now as an artist, in that I moved away from simply distinguishing myself from, and my art from other art by doing something different or doing something unique, but truly getting to explore who I am inside my inner self. And with Lingua Franca, I was by exploring the subjectivity and interiority of this character, and taking on this ambition and this challenge to portray what seems like objective reality, and by objective reality I mean a material or physical reality, that yes, this is an undocumented trans woman of color who is fighting for her dignity and for legal status in this foreign country. But seeing that from a subjective viewpoint and a subjective experience, in that we're not just looking at her as a specimen, with the seeming detachment or impartiality, that I wanted to make Lingua Franca an invitation to empathy, an invitation to see the world, from our eyes, and to walk Brooklyn and New York City in Olivia's shoes. And, this, I think, new frontier of my own art, my own cinema, and where I am now is really a celebration of what I consider to be, at this point, cinema's terra incognita. We've seen so much of what is going on outside and externally in society, but what we haven't yet truly and boldly explored are the inner lives of characters who are a minority. And the lyricism and the sensuality and the poetry that I started to develop in Lingua Franca was something that I really took to a different level in the short film that I directed after that. It was commissioned by New for their series called Women's Tales, and the short film is called Shineless. I wanted to show you a clip from that film. While preparing for this talk, it felt like a tall order to try to, I guess, summarize my journey and my evolution as a filmmaker into a neat narrative, into an art that is easily digestible. And certainly my residency in these past 2 semesters with NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute has been truly a wonderful experience to let me ponder and reflect on that journey. And I've come to a realization that I can't tell you how to become an artist. I can't prescribe a strategy or a trajectory. It's really quite an art. But one thing that I've come to as an epiphany is that, as cliche as that sounds, it's really about getting to know yourself as a person. Like, everyone has their own path to take. And we can only learn from other artists, other filmmakers that have forged their own paths and drowned out the pressures and the forces that try to make them conform to external conventions or norms. And that is why I think I value silence in my own films and in the introspection of my characters, because it's in the silence that we really get to listen to ourselves, to what we really want, and to learn to not pay attention and unlearn what we feel is right or what is great for art. And I hope that we should feel inspired and celebrate and honor the artists, the filmmakers that have come before us. I certainly would not become the filmmaker that I am without Chantal Ackerman or Wong Kar-wai or Ingmar Bergman. But I didn't stop at simply imitating them, but I reflected on what about their art resonated with me when it comes to my own background and history and experience, and gradually come out of my shell and contribute and put forth something that I hope will feel genuine and authentic and striking enough for other disciples and students of the art to learn from as they go on their journey as artists and filmmakers. I'm about to fly to Manila in a week to work on a new film that I'm very, very excited about. And actually when you're waiting outside, we were playing essentially the Spotify playlist of the music that I was listening to while writing this new script. It's called Moonglow. And it's set in the 60s and 70s in Manila. It's a romantic noir. If I give you an elevator pitch, it'd be like Casablanca meets Wong Kar-wai. But it opens with a heist by my character, so I'm acting in it as well. And in the film, two former lovers reunite to crack the case of who broke in and stole a large sum of money from the mansion of a corrupt police chief. So in a way, it feels like a loose remake of Senorita. And, question themselves whether they can maintain their integrity and morality in a system that is corrupt and seamy. So I wanted to also acknowledge the presence of my producer for that project, Alan Bergman. And I will be working again with Isaac. Questions? I hope I wasn't rambling. So first question, I'm curious to hear about your thoughts about the life cycle of a film project. At what point do you feel ready to pursue a new project? Do you write scripts simultaneously? It really depends, because a project is never done after you write the script. It continues to evolve and change as you're shooting the film, as you're editing the film. And so I typically have about 3 to 4 drafts of the script before going to production. And the first draft is really kind of a whirlwind of writing, just a few days to a week of writing nonstop and not editing the script at all. And I just wanted to dump in there as many unfiltered ideas that I have and then put it aside for a few weeks to a month or two. And it's when I pull that script back out that the second and the subsequent drafts take longer because I really am editing. I'm starting to question, whether the scene or this idea belongs, in the film. And I then show it to a few, good friends whose taste I really admire, and maybe one or two whose taste I really don't like. So, whatever suggestion that those people have, I end up doing the opposite. So it's kind of like a negative, but I still like the movie. And when we go into production, I try to strike a delicate balance of sticking to the script, and I advocate this, like being spontaneous, and feeling the scene in the moment, and whether the lines ring true or feel right when I'm shooting the scene. And oftentimes I find myself, really being flexible and adaptable as an independent filmmaker. You learn to develop that muscle because sometimes you don't get your locations until the very last minute, like the slaughterhouse in Lingua Franca. We did not book that until the day before we shot it. And just using the script as a blueprint to film scenes that have a pulse, that feel alive as you're shooting them and as you're experiencing them as a spectator. And then in post is, I think, when the real or the final, should I say, writing begins. And in fact, I tend to tell my collaborators that I'm an editor who sometimes, or who writes, directs, and acts just so I can get the exact raw material that I envision in my mind, to come up or to sculpt the film that I want to end up with in the editing room. And so, I'm not ultimately too hard on myself as a filmmaker, because art and cinema specifically is really the product of what you put out there as an artist and how the audience connects and engages with it. And my responsibility, I feel, is to make that art as accommodating, as open-ended and as accommodating of people's own projection of their experiences, and emotions and thoughts, so that they can make the experience of watching my film their own. If that makes any sense. When making Lingua Franca, how do you jump between directing and acting? What was the most challenging part? I think the fact that I'm a self-taught filmmaker allowed me to think beyond silos, because, and this is my impression, or perhaps my prejudice as someone who didn't go to film school, is that we are trained to pursue certain lanes, to pursue being a writer or director or cinematographer, because that's how you get hired in the industry, not as a, generalist. But I think being liberated from that thinking and from that structure, I ended up taking on these multiple hats and switching between these roles, I guess, quite smoothly, because in my mind I was not playing these different roles, I had one thing to do, and that is make a film. And making a film sometimes has these different facets and aspects to it. And I made sure that I took on the creative roles that were integral for me to translate my vision from the page to the screen without compromise. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts, your thoughts about the life cycle of a film project. At what point do you feel ready to pursue a new project? What is your relationship to landscape as an artist? For example, your stories and scenes emerge from random daily encounters with places. It's funny, I actually get my inspiration while I'm writing from music. Funnily enough, Tropical Gothic, that film about colonialism that I'm developing at the moment. One crucial and key scene from that came after listening to the Nat King Cole version of The Very Thought of You. Very, very different, worlds and inspirations, but somehow it's about, I think, distilling the feeling or that emotion that evokes and inspires in me that becomes translated or transmuted into a totally different milieu and context and characters. And for some reason, that's just how my mind works. The concept of landscape or place really emerges in my mind when I am developing characters, because characters do not exist in a vacuum. They exist, at least in my films, and how I approach character, they exist in very particular and very specific context, socially, politically, and geopolitically as well, in that our identity, our motivations are influenced by where we live. They don't completely and totally determine who we are, but they play a substantial factor of our identity and our behaviors and our thoughts. And that's why, that montage in Brighton Beach that bookends Lingua Franca was actually not shot in principal photography of the film, which we shot in September 2018. I decided to shoot that a few months later in pickup after I had a cut of the film, and something, in me felt that something in the film was missing. And it was that sense of place, that rooting Olivia as a character in a real place. What was the most valuable lesson you have learned about getting financing for your films? I think I occupy a very, very unique place in that I am a developer I'm a filmmaker from the global south, from a developing country, who is living in America, and filmmakers from the global south are supported actually by funds from European countries like France and Germany and the Netherlands, who have a mandate to support filmmakers from the developing world. And that's, I think, the main difference between Europe and North America, in that Europe has that structure in place, but American filmmakers really have to struggle, unfortunately, so much to get financing, because there's very little to no support from the government when it comes to cinema and filmmaking, I think especially fiction filmmaking. But there is a mandate to make films that are commercial and mainstream. And so it really again goes back to every filmmaker has their own individual path, and I think we have to be creative and resourceful in thinking of where we can, get financing for our films, but also to be smart and strategic about how we approach the budget to our films. And personally, I tend to work best, I'm at my most creative when I'm working with certain limitations and parameters. And that includes working with certain budget limitations. For instance, because then, let's say, scene to scene, if there's a scene that costs, $20,000, I then ask myself and my collaborators, like, okay, what is this scene about? Is it about the street, protests? For instance, if it's set in the 70s, that's recreating a whole period, in the street and to feel at massive scale, or is it really about the psychological impact of participating in a protest on the character? And when I told myself it's the latter, we saved $20,000, and I ended up using old footage of actual street protests in Manila in 1970s and projecting it onto the face, using a projector onto the face of the nun character in Apparition. And yeah, so that's just how I work in that. I use, I adapt to the circumstances of my production, but I embrace, these challenges and limitations to become more creative. How has your place in the Philippine diaspora shaped the way you want to influence viewers perceiving your pieces? I think, my films, especially with Lingua Franca, since it's directly about an immigrant, Filipina trans woman, and the fact that they are made by a filmmaker who is an immigrant Filipina trans woman, are intrinsically and by their nature political. I've always been, I'd like to think, quite subtle and quiet about the politics in my films, in that there is a clear political viewpoint, and my focus is to bring about and explore the interiority of the individual, especially the minority in that country. And I think that sense of the Philippine diaspora, that sense of political awareness, emerges intuitively because I was making it from a place not for, commercial profit, but to examine and shed light on a theme, on a character that I care deeply about, which is very clearly, and obviously about a Filipina trans woman. I want to be able to continue making films that I feel passionate about while being part of the industry, having kind of broken into Hollywood in a sense, and leveraging hopefully the goodwill that I've had in the industry to continue pursuing films that shed a light on these invisible and voiceless lives. How has your residency at APA impacted your work. I think now is the perfect time for me to thank the Asian Pacific American Institute of New York University, Crystal, Laura, Amida, because it's really given me a moment, 2 semesters, to think about how far I've come in my journey as a filmmaker, to acknowledge where I started from, as a budding filmmaker in the Philippines. And now, I think in my mid-career, finding out and discovering the new aesthetic and the singular and unique language that I'm developing as a filmmaker, and where I want to take it next. And at every step in my filmmaking journey, I've always taken risks. With every project that I've done, I'd like to think that I've stepped up in a certain way and took on different challenges and new ones. And Moonglow, this next project that I'm going to be working on, represents a different kind of challenge as well, in that I am trying to reimagine not just noir as a genre, and a genre that started out in classic Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, and to give it my unique stamp and signature, but also to reimagine what Philippine cinema, especially international and art house Philippine cinema, can be, in that it doesn't constantly have to be a showcase or a portrait of dissolution and poverty and cynicism, but it can be about hope and idealism and lushness and sensuality. And on that note, I want to thank you all again for joining me here this evening. It's such a special one, and I hope I wasn't rambling too much.